I think it's important to emphasize, first of all, that we don't see journals as an alternative to other outputs of science. So we see these journals as part of open science because we see open access as just as a stepping stone towards an open science future, which is the really powerful development, actually.
We don't usually do breaking news on this podcast, but this week is an exception. EMBO and EMBO Press are announcing that all 5 of their journals will move to full open access by the beginning of 2024. The press publishes the EMBO Journal, EMBO Reports, EMBO Molecular Medicine, Molecular Systems Biology, and co-publishes Life Science Alliance. To promote open science beyond open access, all papers published in EMBO Press journals will also have to include the source data underlying their figures. Welcome to the EMBO Podcast. In this episode, we discussed the new open access policy with the head of EMBO Press, Bernd Pulver. We also talk about the role of journals in a preprint and open science world. Thomas Lemberger, who runs several innovative projects at EMBO Press, spoke about the past and future of open access and open science. And University of São Paulo biochemist Alicia Kowaltowski talked about some of the unintended consequences of open access in exacerbating existing inequality. To get started, we asked Bernd, what exactly is happening?
What's the big news? Okay, so what we're going to do is we are going to shift all of our journals, and that's we have 5 journals at EMBO Press, and we are going to shift them all to full open access. So that means that all the papers that you will read in these journals will be accessible on an open access license, a CC BY license, to anyone in the world, really, be it public or in the interested scientific community. And that's a shift because while we've always been active in open access for many years, since 2005, in fact, it is now a big shift for us internally because our 2 largest journals have been what's called hybrid open access for many years, in fact, since 2007. And that means that all of these open access papers have to sustain the costs of producing these journals. Previously at EMBO, we basically had a cross-subsidy that our 3 open access journals were essentially supported partially by our hybrid journals, which were still supported largely through subscription fees. The reason we're doing it now is really severalfold. So we have always said that we will see how the community really chooses to publish. And we're finding that more and more people are choosing to publish open access journal in our elective open access journals, EMBO Journal, EMBO Reports. So we're above 60% of authors who are choosing to publish open access anyway. And we've always said when it reaches these levels, we will naturally essentially flip to open access anyway. So that's one thing. The other thing is that we want to be aligned with where funders, many of the world's top funders are going with this, which is really to have mandates towards open access, or more interestingly, open science, which is a topic we should come to too, which is something we're strongly supporting, of course. And basically, we have managed to also streamline our costs in such a way in the last few years to ensure that we can remain equitable to the scientific community. And that's something that we really care about. And that's always a really big challenge in open access. So how do you balance the quality of a journal with being equitable? And equitable means to be essentially accessible to any author in the world who is doing great science.
The cost of producing a scientific paper is a topic of heated discussion these days and poses a problem for equity in open access publishing. EMBO and EMBO Press make public detailed breakdowns of the costs of publishing in their journals. If you want to see what the article processing charges and soon-to-be extinct subscription fees pay for, look for the financial transparency features on our site. Thomas Lemberger is the deputy head of EMBO Press, where he runs several innovative projects, including source data and the refereed preprint platform Review Commons. In 2005, Thomas was a postdoc making the transition to scientific editor at EMBO's first fully open access journal, Molecular Systems Biology. Thomas also worked at EMBO Journal at the time.
MSB, Molecular Systems Biology, the abbreviation is MSB, was started with this idea that it could be a sort of a new journal in this new field with better access to the data underlying the papers, to the computational codes that were used to analyze the data. It was really the emergence of computational biology in all its glory, trying to model in computers living organisms and understand the processes with computational models. And that was all quite new and quite challenging. And so there was this idea that we would like to have a journal that would provide better access to all this information. And that was the fundamental justification, I think, really to start an open access journal. And MSB was launched as the first open access journal at EMBO.
So for people who may not have been around at the time, it's interesting to know that at this time there are no preprint servers in biology. Well, there's no bioarchive, but there is archive in physics and for physics and for math and for computational biology. Do you think EMBO was able to start MSB also because this is an interdisciplinary community that had some already familiarity with open access and open sharing of data and tools, more than probably biology at the time?
Yes, that is true. I don't know the role of archive, but for sure, there was a very strong influence from the computational biology community that was already used to share code, and the concept of open source code was, of course, not at all novel. And we had a couple of editorials from George Church, etc., where it was very clear that when producing so much biological data with the new omics platforms, but also small-scale data that were highly quantitative and used directly in computation models, it was obvious that the way to go was to share this data across the entire community. And again, that was the strong and deep justification for open access for MSB. It was a community that was living from that. There were many computational biologists, and this is still the case, that were not producing data themselves, but analyzing the data from others. And we wanted to show that it is a bona fide scientific activity to derive novel insights by analyzing data and making sense of it.
After Molecular Systems Biology, which started as an open access journal at EMBO Press in 2005, and when it was still a very boutique and niche thing to do, the next journal to go, if I'm correct in this, fully open access at EMBO Press was EMBO Molecular Medicine, and you've phrased this in terms of equity, not just for the scientific community, but for patients, patient groups, anyone who might be interested in research that is of immediate clinical interest. And this is to me a very important point, because when I'm trying to track down, for example, the basis of many open clinical trials, I find that the closer you get to the clinical end, the more closed journals tend to be. Not just the big brand, New England, Lancet, and so forth.
Yeah,
but
right.
The specialist journals in heart surgery or cancer immunotherapy, they are also extremely opaque in this respect, right? And ultimately, we're speaking of the researcher paying for it or the library paying for it, but the taxpayers actually paying for it, or philanthropy, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's an important point. And in fact, just historically, you're right that EMBO Molecular Medicine was the second journal that went fully open access. So our hybrid approach was 2007, which is 2 years after MSB went full open access. Was launched full open access. But then 2009, in 2012, we moved EMBO Molecular Medicine to full open access, specifically, as you said, because it was a more medical journal where we really saw the need to be fully accessible rapidly, because of course it's important for taxpayers to essentially have access to all the exciting science that's published in principle. I would also say pragmatically that the medical need is much more urgent than other interesting pieces of science that we publish, which have always been accessible after the 6-month self-deposition policy that we've had for many, many years. So just to explain what that is, after 6 months, you were always allowed or encouraged even to self-archive your work in the free, basically in accepted format. And we would, after 1 year, we've always posted automatically on PubMed Central the final version of the papers, and they were freely accessible in our journals too. So that means freely, not on an open access license, but freely accessible. So, but that one year lag is really too much for medical papers. I agree with that.
People were familiar in their university or in their research institute with the annual fight where the librarian basically would go struggle with the publishers to find a solution, not necessarily a fair one, but one that they could afford to have. And this would involve things like bundling journals and these massive packages that you would get, especially from the larger commercial publishers. And now we've entered a different set of agreements, which I'm not sure everybody is familiar with, which are these read and publish agreements. Can you tell us a bit about those?
Yeah, so that's a really important note that you make here. So one of the premises of going open access was always that the authors have more control and choose which journals provide the value that they see fit for their research, essentially. So the idea was to really empower the scientific community to be much more proactive in choosing journals and by the value that they add to the system. So in principle, this is great. So the idea was to remove it from this very sort of intense negotiations that you mentioned between librarians and the publishing industry for discounts and bundles and so on. Everybody knows the so-called great deal or the big deal from Elsevier and so on in this respect. So that's was always a problem for small independent non-for-profit publishers because they were easily outcompeted also by the very large conglomerate publishers, for-profit publishers, such as Elsevier's, Springer Nature, Wiley, and so on. So that's something that has come full circle, though. So you just mentioned the publish and read agreements. What has emerged is that the author pays model is, which still exists in many parts of the world, is turning out to be very hard to administer and quite clunky. So we currently have a situation where still a lot of the money is sequestered in libraries, and authors are often not really awarded separate funds to publish papers themselves. Essentially, so often they have to dip into their research budgets to publish papers, to publish these APC fees that I mentioned. And that's a really big problem because it takes money away from the research, and that's really not the intention. So what has emerged in Europe initially, and now increasingly in other places, particularly also North America and some Asian countries, is these publish and read agreements, which are essentially a way to bundle again papers and pay centrally for open access publishing. Now, the reason I said it's full circle is because we're now again in these intense negotiation rounds, and maybe emblematic here is the project Deal in Germany, which was one of the first ones of these at a national level, where many hundreds of universities came together across Germany and negotiated together with the larger publishers. And initially this was with Wiley, who placed the first deal with Project Deal in Germany, and then with Springer Nature. Of course, Elsevier is also negotiating, but you can immediately see what's happening here, that the large publishers have the seat at the table. They negotiate the first deals, and smaller university publishers such as Rockefeller University are not included at this point, although this has been noticed, and there is strong efforts now by conglomerates such as Project Deal to make standardized contracts or agreements that can be really mapped out in a much more efficient and equitable way across also small not-for-profit publishers. So I think this is crucially important, because otherwise we're going to amplify this sort of drift into very large publishing houses, which is not good for anyone really, because you're reducing diversity.
The increasing dominance of the open access option at EMBO Press hybrid journals is remarkable. The proportion of EMBO journal authors opting for open access went from 16% in 2014 to 59% in 2022. For EMBO reports over the same period, the open access fraction quintupled from 10 to 51%. Of course, this growth reflects not only authors' individual choices, but also structural changes like open access mandates from funding agencies. The open access boom was not, however, evenly distributed, with European corresponding authors accounting for 3/4 of open access publications at EMBO Press hybrid journals. When you go away, you shift the cost from readers and institutional libraries to authors and their research budgets. So you mentioned a gradual shift in the hybrid journals in the proportion of authors submitting to open access versus the traditional model. Is there anything you can tell us about the demographics or the types of authors or the geography of authors in this shift?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, and it sort of reflects, in fact, what you might expect. So first of all, let me pick up on this shift of finances from the institutions that represent the readers to the authors. That sounds deceptively simple, but it's actually a massive issue. So basically for two reasons. One is that many institutions are either more reader intensive or more author intensive, if you want. So research institutions, which can be universities or just research institutes such as the CRIC or something in London, obviously have a huge output of excellent research. So for them, the costs will be dramatically changing because they move from a single subscription to many papers they're publishing. Whereas other universities that are more teaching universities will of course benefit because their subscription will be compensated for by relatively few papers charges, essentially. So there's a global, very big demographic shift there. And the other thing is that there's inherently just mathematically many fewer authors than there are subscribers or readers, essentially. So you're really amplifying any inequities in the system dramatically because there's so many fewer authors really that have to bear the costs of publishing a given research paper. So that's why we have to be very, very careful that we don't cross barriers here. But to your question about the demographics now of the people who are choosing to publish open access, it's, as you might predict, it's largely European authors. In fact, we have almost all of our European authors now are choosing the open access route in EMBO journal and EMBO reports. In the US, it's increased quite dramatically over the last years too, actually. And Asia has also, various Asian countries have also started to opt in more, but that came a bit later. And it seems to be increasing. But it really is very neatly divided between if you want, the North and the global South. And that's something that we are also aware of, that we really, again, as I said before, we don't want to leave anyone behind here.
Alicia Kowatowski is a professor of biochemistry at the University of São Paulo, Brazil. Alicia and her colleagues José Arruda, Paulo Nussensweig, and Ariel Silber recently wrote a piece posted on the Scholarly Kitchen site analyzing the sometimes counterintuitive effects of open access on researchers in the Global South.
I think the scientific community in general has come to a consensus that we want to openly read manuscripts, and that's really important to fully use all this knowledge that we're acquiring through science. So open access is not something I question at all. The problem is that as we're transitioning to open access publications in journals, and these open access publications in journals are mostly upon payments of article processing charges of APCs, we can create a different kind of paywall in publications, which isn't the paywall to read a publication, but instead is a paywall to publish. So I think scientists who don't have as much funding as some other scientists can find it very difficult to equitably publish their findings in journals and be read side by side with authors who have more funding, given that article processing charges are often very, very high. And particularly scientists in developing countries, such as myself, I work in Brazil, we have always managed to publish equitably and have findings that authors in the global north also read. But today I find that the charges that we have to pay to publish in open access journals are so high that they're often 2-3 times what I earn per month as a full professor. And they're more than what a student earns in a year. And it's been very difficult to publish in these journals. So we're very worried, as journals are all transitioning to an open access publication scheme in which you pay to publish open access, if people are going to start thinking about us and not exclude us as publishing people also, and have a good policy for waivers and for discounts for the Global South so that you're not excluding us from publishing. And I'm going to put it out there. I think that being excluded from publishing is much worse than being excluded from reading, because not having open access wasn't good. Having a subscription paywall was never good, but you could always ask the authors for a copy. That was never illegal, and that's a good way to get this copy. Now, being excluded from publishing, people simply won't know that our work exists, and that's worse.
When you looked at what actually happens to different countries, one very interesting finding is that actually in the lowest income countries, the fraction of open access publications is quite high, whereas there is a problem for countries like Brazil or Argentina, for example. Why is that?
So what we did actually was go into Scopus. And of course, this is already a problem because not all journals and not all publications are in Scopus. But this is where we could find this quite easily. And we searched for how many publications came from each country, from countries that were upper middle income, that were lower middle income, low income, and high income. And what we find is that a very, very small percentage of publications, actually, I think it's 0.35% of publications, have at least one author from a low income economy country. The reason for that is first that these aren't all that many countries. These are mostly countries in Central Africa, Afghanistan, countries at war, for example. There are 0 countries in Latin America that are classified as low income by the World Bank, for example. And I don't think most people know that. So these countries really are few countries. And also economically, they don't invest in science at all because of all their economic problems. So we really have very few authors from these countries. On the other hand, most journals do have waiver policies for authors from low-income countries. So I think that these very few times, these 0.35% of times in which these authors do manage somehow to publish science, they are covered by waiver policy. So they don't have to pay for article publishing charges. And we find that percentage-wise, authors from low-income countries actually publish more in open access journals than authors even from high-income countries. I think the problem is in the middle-income countries. So there are 2 middle-income country classifications by the World Bank. There's the lower middle income and the upper middle income. Lower middle-income countries include a few Latin American countries. Haiti, El Salvador, Bolivia are low-income economies according to the World Bank. And these and most large editorial organizations qualify at least for partial discounts. So they don't have to pay the full APCs, they pay partial APCs. That I find a problem already because these economies are so weak that even with a 50% discount, the APCs are going to be quite high for them. On the other hand, most Latin American countries, including Brazil, are classified as upper middle income economies by the World Bank. And as upper middle income economies, most journals do not grant us neither waivers nor discounts. And when we look at the percentage of publications that are open access in upper middle income economies that don't get waivers or discounts in any journal, they're very low. They're actually the lowest of all. So low income economies publish quite a bit percentage-wise in open access journals. Lower middle income economies, which are about 4% of the authors, so they also publish very little in total. They publish less in open access journals, but they do get discounts, even though that might not be enough. Then upper middle income economies that don't get these discounts publish very little in open access. This to me seems to indicate that we're already choosing to publish less in these journals right now because of the economic barrier of paying for these APCs. And that worries me because journals are transitioning very quickly to open access only. And we do want to read the full manuscripts online. The question is, this transformation is happening so quickly and without a control for pricing, and also without regards to the economic barriers for our struggling economies. Is this going to exclude us? And that's what we're worried about.
Do you think preprints have helped at all? Because you mentioned the inability to get your research results out in front of the international scientific community. So do you think things like bioRxiv or arXiv have helped a bit level the playing field?
Oh, absolutely. I'm a total supporter of preprints. And actually, we don't need to have open access in journals right now. If everybody preprinted, and if everybody updated their preprints before resubmitting their manuscript to a journal responding to reviewers, we would have every single paper completely open access in its final form as preprints and easily searchable. All you would have to do is get the journal paper and look up the preprint, and you would find the full text of the paper, and that would happen for free. And that would also break with the economic problem we have with journal publishers. So EMBO is linked to a scientific society. It's different than most journal publishers, which are private companies and are for-profit companies. And these companies also have a characteristic, which is that they don't respond to typical market values. You don't go around looking for the best journal for your paper in terms of pricing. That's not how it works. It's a very different economy. And that's why these publishers typically have very, very high profit margins. And that's one of the main complaints we have about subscription journals, that we're paying a lot for these subscriptions. These companies have very high profit margins, and they don't respond to these economic pressures. The open access system in which you pay to publish, the gold open access system, doesn't break with this system. You're still paying these companies, and there still is no control over pricing. You're just paying before and not after with the subscription. So I don't think that resolves the problem with these companies. On the other hand, preprinting does resolve this problem because you're preprinting for free and you can find these papers there. I think we also have to do a whole bunch of other changes in the publishing landscape. We need more journals that are controlled by scientists, that come to benefit scientists, less, for-profit journals that don't have any scientists in the mix. We need to responsibly assess research in which the research is more important than where it was published, than the brand names and all that. There are all sorts of changes that have to happen, but these changes take time.
We're going in the right direction, but things are taking, of course, a long time to really shift. I think we have to really design research assessment much more professionally and systematically to scale, basically, with the huge complexity of science that we're now assessing.
Well, and the different kinds of roles that people play that are important, right? So it could be argued that, for example, the most important thing, in a sense, published in the last 3 years was the posting of the SARS-CoV-2 sequence to a virology database, which was not a paper at the time, but certainly had a massive, to use the word you did not want to use, impact on everything that happened, both in terms of research and in terms of public health and clinical development. And recently, we had on the EMBO podcast Corey Bargman, and she made the very clear point that if the scientific community if the life sciences community specifically isn't valuing these kind of contributions, it's a choice. And she mentioned the example of CERN and the Large Hadron Collider and so forth, where the team leader's part of their job on these 1,000 author papers is to then write an assessment of the contribution of the engineers, of the physicists who were doing instrumentation development, or whoever was tracking the little particle flying off to the left there, to make sure that they received proper credit, not just in terms of a cookie or a patent ahead, but something that will actually impact their career progression, right? And right now, in academia, in the life sciences, that's not something we're very good at doing at the moment. Everything doesn't have to be a paper, as you've said before. But right now, for assessment, unfortunately, it usually is.
Yeah, so that's a really, really important point. And again, it comes to this issue of looking holistically first point is to look holistically at open science outputs much more broadly than just the journal papers in a few highly selective journals. That's important. On the Large Hadron Collider, just a sort of snarky note on the side, of course, it's also known that every author on these Large Hadron Collider papers did get a PI position ultimately. So in essence, these experiments are so important and visible that they still give you credit. The problem is much more on typical biology research papers where you have maybe 15 authors. What really counts at the moment in biology is the first authors and the corresponding authors. For research assessment, that's where it stops. And that's why we're seeing this very strong inflation in co-first authorships, which go up to 5, even more now, and even corresponding authorships, co-corresponding authorships, which go well beyond 3 these days. So this is something we have to grapple with, and we have. So basically, we have an ontology was developed that's becoming a widely adopted standard across journals called CREDIT, which goes a little bit towards really being more granular about the individual contributions of authors in a sort of machine-readable way, so you can actually extract exactly what every author position did on the paper. Still, that's not really enough. So what we're excited about is to go even more granular. So as we post all the source data now underlying each figure in the paper. We even mandate this now for a year. And that has allowed us actually to give also an authorship to every figure panel in the paper. So we basically have a data version of every paper now that we post separately on a database run by the EBI. And that allows us to also add an authorship to every one of these figure panels. And we hope this will really be, and ultimately this should be machine readable and so on, in a way that also can be used by research assessment exercises to really see what that fifth author on the paper really did. So that is great for credit. It also adds accountability. So when things go wrong, let's say there's an research integrity issue on a very specific part of a paper, which is typically what happens. It's not each figure in a paper that's problematic. It's one very specific piece of data in the paper. We know then precisely which lab of a multi-lab collaboration actually was responsible for that piece of data.
That's really interesting, and it opens a possibility there in terms of now the words in my brain, impact, which is to see not just which papers are cited, which has always been problematic. Even if we move down from the level of just the journal citation factor, the individual paper factor, for example, one thing that commercial publishers have known for a while is that a high-profile retraction actually boosts the citation rate in the short period quite a bit, and it's not positive in terms of scientific output. But we could, in this scenario, actually see which data items are useful to the science community downstream and who made them, which is a really exciting possibility.
So that's exciting. I would even go further and sort of articulate that we should move what we're currently doing in terms of preprinting, which is essentially ready-to-go research papers just accelerated by posting them on an open preprint platform before they go through all the peer review and revision process at journals, to go further and really have a new structure of data preprints, which are really standalone figures that are generated, that are not decorated with a huge sort of narrative interpretation that ties complex data sets together, which is still a very important output to understand complex science in the form of research papers. But there's so much data that doesn't really need that narrative structure. And we should really start early and further upstream with preprints to really share these data preprints, which would have all the metadata associated with them, authorship associated with them, and maybe even some quality control steps already. And then assemble these for a subset of the data that we share into this more classical full preprint and full research paper that is still important. But I think we should move away from publishing every piece of science that we can think of in this form of a narrative research paper, which is really not scalable. We can't peer review all of these. We're publishing more than 3 million of these papers per year these days in the biosciences. And one can immediately see that the scalability in terms of peer review, which is 3 referees on every paper, that is a bottleneck that emerges immediately because as this grows exponentially, the referee base has to grow 3 times faster, essentially. And And that's not happening. So journals are struggling more and more to find excellent referees who also have the time it takes, which is many hours, to do a proper job. So I would rather share things in a more granular way, upstream in a preprint format, and then reserve this very important step of peer review to a subset of papers. But research assessment has to adopt to valorize these outputs. Otherwise, everybody will always rush to publish in very few journals that matter for research assessment in this classical research paper format.
I asked Thomas Lemberger for examples of how EMBO Press is promoting open science beyond open access to the classical research paper, and how this may affect research assessment, broadening the scope of work that can and should be formally credited for its contribution to science.
We have very sort of advanced policies in terms of data sharing. We ask now pretty much systematically authors to provide the data behind the papers, and we have an entire curation platform and automatic deposition platform to take care of this data. So we have a curation platform that curates the content and the experimental design of every figure and associate that to the data. And this combination of data and metadata is then deposited automatically in a database at the EBI, EMBO EBI, which is called BioStudies. And essentially for every paper, there is its pair record in BioStudies that serves as a hub for all the data behind the paper, whether this data is hosted on external resources like Geo, ArcGIS, or Pride, or whether they are small scale and attached as so-called supplementary data as Excel files and so on, or Western blots behind the images. All this data is gathered in a single record that is really linked one-to-one with the published paper. So that's one thing we do that is sort of emphasizing the integration of the practice of open science in the publishing process. Now, we have other policies that combine that with checks of the integrity of the data to be sure that these data are of high quality and trustable. And finally, we have also initiated a couple of years ago or promoted the use of data citations. It's important, of course, to request that the data are made public, but we have also to be careful to provide credit to data producers. And data citation is one of those tools that can provide credit to data producers, in particular when these data producers may not even appear as authors in classical papers. And I'm thinking of core facilities that nowadays are producing most of the large-scale systematical data. These people are working very hard with very high standards, and the data citation can provide a mechanism to give them credit, academic credit, for the work they do as data producers.
Why does science still need high-quality traditional journals? Why not just a preprint? Why not just sharing data on servers,
Absolutely.
depositing sequences, depositing expression maps, or whatever the current trend may be, and that's that?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a very reasonable and very important question. So we've always said, and that's particularly important for journals such as the EMBO Press journals, which are all very, very selective. So the reason why we are quite expensive is very largely due to the fact that we only publish between 10 and 15% of the papers that are submitted to us. So why are journals needed, and why do we still need that very, very strong selectivity? So I think it's important to emphasize, first of all, that we don't see journals as an alternative to other outputs of science. So we see these journals as part of open science, and that's a very, very important concept that we maybe can delve into in just a second, because we see open access as just as a stepping stone towards an open science future, which is the really powerful development, actually. So the reason we think journals are still important are largely because we still provide a high quality control service. And that's based on, in our case, both the hands-on editorial selection, but in particular, of course, the high quality peer review that we apply. But it also includes data curation services that we apply, research integrity screening services that we apply systematically to all of our papers. So we really add value to the science that's been shared. Now, just a quick point on the selectivity. We don't just select papers on the basic quality of the research that's been done. That should be a no-brainer for any journal or any service that selects. Essentially, it doesn't have to be a journal, but any service that evolves, that selects, has to select for quality, of course. But we select also, importantly, for the interest of the work, for the breadth of the work. Sometimes the word impact is used. I don't want to use that because it's been abused in various ways. But it does describe what we're selecting for, which is really to select the most important work that people really should read. And the reason that remains an important selection criteria, I believe, is that we're swimming in an ocean of information. And while we're also developing very rapidly search technology, especially with artificial intelligence now, completely new ways to access complex information, ultimately science is still a human enterprise at this point, and humans have to absorb complex information. And it's really crucial that they absorb complex information, not just in their own area of expertise, which is becoming increasingly narrow and specialized because science is growing so much. It's natural that everyone's becoming more specialized because we know so much more about every specific topic. The most exciting science happens at the interfaces of specific domains. And I think, so I sometimes call this the coffee room effect, that you basically come across science that you didn't know existed, you didn't expect. And that's the hallmark of great institutes, that you meet scientists that work on other things, you chat in the coffee room, and you design new projects just on the fly based on these discussions. And that's exactly the role of broad-based journals such as the EMBO Journal, that we get scientists to read on topics that they wouldn't have expected to find. And that's still a service that is crucially important, in my view, to the human reader. And we hope it's useful, but we're always listening to the scientific community if it is still useful, and we will adapt accordingly, of course. Now, just, I don't want to go on too long about this, but of course, this process has been abused in becoming a sort of proxy for research assessment. And when you hire scientists or when you award grants, the publication in one of these broad-based, highly selective journals is seen as a hallmark of great science, which is then used as a proxy to award your funding, to award your tenure, etc., etc. That's not a service that journals really want to provide. Of course, it makes us important and powerful, but that's something, and that's why we launched the San Francisco Declaration of Research Assessment with our colleagues exactly 10 years ago, next month actually, to point this out. It's of course a very good correlation that the science we publish should be among the most fundable science there is, but it's not an absolute correlation, and we have to be very careful that we are not abusing the selectivity for things it wasn't designed to provide.
EMBO Press clearly fits the bill of a publishing organization working with the research community to develop new tools, experiment with new kinds of publications, and promote policies that can impact research assessment to reward researchers contributing to open science. But what about Alicia's more pressing question, the immediate problem? What solutions will EMBO Press offer to authors who cannot afford open access publication fees?
Yeah, so that's a really important question, Thiago. And I think the important starting point is that we and many of the other quality journals have long-standing agreements with Research for Life and other similar basic projects that essentially give free access to authors from the poorest nations in the world. That's something that's been in place for many years, and it's very, very important. However, the reality is that we actually receive very few papers from these countries. What's particularly important is countries where we do get excellent research papers submitted. And I include just a few examples. Argentina, Chile, and Brazil would be countries like that. But it also includes India, for example, which has a very high level research community. We just returned from a trip from there, and other countries that you can, including Eastern Europe, for example, where the funding is dramatically lower than in certain Western European countries. So what I think we need beyond that is a waiver scheme that case by case, authors can be absolved from paying anything essentially, or paying a reduced fee, because it's not just the country of origin. It's also if you're an early career researcher who maybe is a senior author on a paper, a corresponding author. If you're between grants, for example, you sometimes just lose the ability to pay even as a senior person. So I think we need the possibility to be context dependent here. That's really important. It's also true to say another dimension is the subject matter. So certain areas in science are funded much, much better than other areas. But the fees, we currently have a one-size-fits-all fee. The fees are the same. So this is obviously much more dramatic in the social sciences and so on, where the funding is much, much lower. But it's also true in biology, where certain areas receive much less funding. So that's another dimension. So I think we have to move beyond waivers here also to having a more stratified mechanism of payments. So essentially, one can immediately think of things such as incorporating the GDP of a country or the total funding of a country in a sort of algorithmic way of layering the charges according to those aspects. And that's something that's not really happening right now. In publishing, there's certain attempts to start that. So, for example, Public Library of Science PLOS has started to have a more layered process in their payments. That's something I think is particularly important, and we will certainly work on this very hard by the time we go open access. But for now, we certainly always will have a buffer mechanism that anyone who cannot pay can apply for waiver, and we will be very happy to issue that if there's strong arguments for that.
It's vital to correct inequities created by open access publication fees. Economic inequality is a challenge for open access as it is for traditional scientific publication. And it's not the only problem that migrated to away from subscription journals. Open access mandates, especially without controls for pricing and quality, can produce perverse incentives, and the so-called predatory journals have also moved aggressively into open access. An interesting discussion we had a while back with Adriano Aguzzi was of a model where the funders would open competitive calls for publishers, where hopefully you would demonstrate not only that you have an impact, but that you perform the kind of services that you mentioned, that you curate data well, that you're making new tools to make data searchable and available, that you do integrity checks, and that ultimately, hopefully, we can assess journals not just based on the immediate 2-year impact, but also on the lasting contributions that the bulk of papers make to science, how solid they are over time.
So that's a very, very crucial concept that you just articulated. It's something we've proposed actually to Plan S funders and European national funders for some time. We would love to move to that situation, because a lot of the costs at EMBO, and we've had a transparent finance policy for some time, so people can to some extent at least see that also in the finances that we publish. A lot of our costs really come through this quality control process that you just mentioned, such as data curation, which is not something we charge extra for. So the problem with open access is that it's very quick to discourage these sort of very valuable additional steps that journals provide, and it can very easily turn into a race to the bottom, where the more you publish, the more money you make. And this has been really the ugly face of this has been the predatory journal growth that you've just mentioned too. So I completely share your view that we should rather move to a situation where we have many fewer journals. There's currently over 35,000 journals. We have to ask ourselves if that's really a reasonable number to have, when we have things like preprints, which are a very effective, rapid way to share scientific information with minimal quality control checks, essentially, which is very effective. So why do we need to decorate papers with sort of very quick peer review, when it really adds limited value at a certain level of journal? And that would liberate huge amounts of funds, by the way, which we can then reinvest in quality control steps at a smaller number of journals. So that's one way to finance it. The other way is exactly as you said, if you want top down, that you have competitive research grants journals can apply to to add these steps. So I'm really looking forward to sort of what I call a hybrid diamond open access future, where part of the costs are covered by authors or publish and read agreements, and part of it is covered more centrally through ideally a competitive way, as you just articulate, for these extra quality control steps that really and open science mechanisms that are so crucial in the next years of sharing science.
To learn the details of EMBO Press's move to full open access publication at all journals, please visit the Press's webpage. To explore some of our innovative tools for open science, visit source data, review comments, or the early evidence-based pages. Alicia Kowatowski's analysis of the differential economic and geographic impact of open access can be found at the Scholarly Kitchen. Thank you for listening to the EMBO Podcast.